So without further ado, let me read Kara's bio and turn it over to her. Kara is an attorney with Tierney Lawrence, and she represents nonprofit and tax-exempt organizations in all aspects of their operation and management. She provides general tax and business advice to public charities, private foundations, professional societies and trade associations, corporate foundations, social welfare organizations, and political organizations. In addition, she counsels tax-exempt organizations on political lobbying and advocacy activities, unrelated business income tax, grant making, business contracts, and the use of complex legal structures. We're very lucky to have her here today. I've seen this presentation. I know she does a great job. So please make Kara feel welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here. I've spoken in this room quite a few times, although not recently. And I love giving this presentation. I was giving it a lot last year, as you can imagine. Some things have changed then, which is bringing up some new questions we're all having. So kind of before I begin, maybe someone could give me some examples of some of the lobbying you've been doing, just because it helps me give good examples of, you know, what lobbying may or may not be. Yes?
We took a position on the tobacco tax.
Okay, so maybe health issues.
Yeah, or just like on referendum.
Okay, referendums. Yes?
We've been lobbying RTD about accessory.
Okay. All right. So that's very helpful. So I give this lectures both to nonprofits and to attorneys. I think I might have given you the outline that has lots of the legal things, which is good, but because it's more complex. But I'll try to, you need to know the legal, understand the legal part of it. So I am going to give you the legal reasonings behind it. And it's also interesting and helps you understand it, but I'll try not to keep it too tax heavy because, you know, that's what this is. It's in the tax code. So let me just, with that, start off about the big picture behind this, like the reasoning, the policy reasoning behind this. If you give money to a 501c3 charity, you get a tax deduction, correct? That's one of the reasons that we set them up. It gives benefit to the donor. Now, there's lots of other different tax-exempt organizations, but only 501c3s get a charitable deduction. So they have higher levels of benefit. They're subject to higher standards because they have a double tax benefit. The donor gets a charitable tax deduction, and the organization itself is exempt from paying taxes. So there's other organizations which we won't really talk about, like C4s, C5s, trade unions, social welfare organizations. Donations to them are not tax exempt, but they do get exemption from income tax. So they have, the rules aren't as strict as around them because they don't have this kind of double taxation issue. And when we're talking about this, think about what taxation is, right? In this particular case, it's the taxpayers subsidizing nonprofits. That's what it is. It's a subsidy from taxpayers. And I just think it's important to bring that home because what the tax code is saying by saying these organizations are tax exempt and that 501c3s don't have to, donations to them are currently, tax deductible, is that society as a whole, American society, believes that C3 organizations are important. And it's important enough that we're going to subsidize them by giving tax donations and by not having them pay tax. And that's important because that's kind of the big picture around this conversation is what's the American public subsidizing? So with that, donations again to C3s are tax deductible as charitable contributions. The Internal Revenue Code specifically says donations for lobbying are not tax deductible. Donations to candidates for public office are not tax deductible. Those are specific provisions. So, the idea here when we're talking about these things is if lobbying is not tax deductible if you directly gave to an organization or if you're a business, like whatever business it is that you're lobbying on behalf of, those are not tax deductible as business expenses. So we don't kind of want to use C3s as a conduit to get around these rules for non-deductibility of lobbying and political expenses. And again, get back to where we're talking about here. The Internal Revenue Code says society as a whole thinks it's okay for us as the general public, as taxpayers, to subsidize 501c3s. But we don't want to subsidize lobbying expenditures, and we don't want to subsidize political expenditures. And the reason why is everyone has such different views on these things. Why, if you are for Trump, and why would you want to subsidize what Hillary Clinton's doing and vice versa? It's the idea that charities, because they're charitable, scientific, educational, what they're doing is beneficial to all society, whereas lobbying and political activities are very specific to your particular viewpoint. So why would, you know, so that's why as a, you know, society, we don't want to subsidize those particular activities through giving them tax deductions, although we often do subsidize them through tax exempt organizations. Yeah, so just think about that, because these are kind of the big picture reasons, and it's going to go into some of the policy things we're going to be talking about. It really is this idea that, you know, if someone's lobbying for a political point of view or legislation that's so against your personal beliefs, you don't want to subsidize that as a taxpayer. It's fine for them to do it, but you don't want to have society pay for it. Whereas C3s, because they're, again, have to be charitable and educational, scientific, it seemed to be okay to have the taxpayer subsidize that. So let's talk a bit more about what partisan political activities are. The technical term used by Internal Revenue Code is called exempt function activities, which means the function of influencing or attempting to influence the selection, nomination, election, or appointment of any individual to any public office or an office in a political organization. So right now people are running for the chair of the DNC. That includes running for political office. So first of all, what's a candidate for public office? A candidate, you know, this used to be pretty easy. Someone would announce their candidacy that they're running. And usually that happens when someone files papers, but now people, you know, they're going to become a candidate, or even if they haven't filed their papers. But basically someone has to announce in some way, shape, or form that they're running for public office. Now there's something called non-elective public office, which are like judicial appointees. So a Supreme Court nominee, something like that. They're not running for public office. So just to be clear, this doesn't talk about, it also doesn't talk about cabinet appointees. So what's going on now, those are not people running for public office because they're not elected. They're subject to confirmation. But public office is pretty broad. It includes school board elections. It includes county commissioner elections, RTD elections, Denver City Council elections. So again, it could be very local level offices, not just for the House of Representative or the state house or a governor or anything like that. It really can go down. And I think in Colorado, we see a lot of school board or RTD boards, things like that. So what does it mean to participate in a political campaign? I think the key thing here is the tax code says direct or indirect, which means it's not a matter of saying vote for or vote against a candidate, which obviously is participating. You could do a lot of things, and this is where C3s may get in trouble, where you're doing something suggestive. So that's this indirect participation. So again, you don't need the magic words of vote for or vote against. Anything that might be indirectly construed as potentially supporting or opposing a candidate for public office would be a violation. We'll get into some more examples later than that. But here's an interesting example just from an IRS reading where an IRS ruling is for the issue of whether you're pro-choice or pro-life. If put out something saying, you know, vote for, you know, vote pro-choice or vote pro-life, that's the one issue the IRS has ruled on, is that it's directly attributed to a particular political party or a candidate. So if you say pro-choice, that means Democrat. And if you say pro-life, that means Republican. And that's the only thing the IRS has said is on that subject, because, you know, arguably there's topics that aren't necessarily, I mean, there may be considered to be leaning one way or another in terms of a political party, but not necessarily. But in terms of using those words, that's this indirect support. If you're saying vote pro-life, that means you're giving a pro-democratic, action, and that would be viewed as a C3 to be in prohibition of this Johnson Amendment. Let's talk about really what C3s see a lot more, because I know, oh yes?
Out of curiosity, if you were to just post something that John Smith is running city council, would that be? Arguably.
It's all about the context. So we'll get into some of that now, because I'll tell you where C3, because you guys are like, oh, I never sit there and say vote for, vote against. We don't do that. Here's where the C3s do get involved in, and you could see it's sometimes hard to say. You know what the IRS has said about this for C3s is, we can't really tell you what's indirect political, prohibited political speech, but we know it when we see it, which is not helpful. And there's been a lot of talk where them should be giving better guidelines. Yes?
How does it relate to, you have your nonprofit and then you have your personal beliefs, and on
Right.
social media you'll post something that's nonprofit.
Okay.
But I have certain
Yeah.
views that are out of social
Yeah,
media.
and the question is, and sorry, I have to repeat the questions, is what's the difference between your individual personal beliefs and your and the nonprofit's beliefs? You're right as an individual to do anything you want, but you have to do that on your individual behalf and not on behalf of the organization. So this is when you get very clear about, okay, whatever, maybe your organization has its own Facebook page. Make sure the organizational Facebook page has to follow these rules. Your personal one does not. You could do whatever you want. So it's really being very clear about on whose behalf you're speaking, or if you're, there's a board member on behalf of your organization, you can't do that. But personally you can. So you have to wear two hats, but you have to be very careful in terms of how you're communicating with people about your beliefs and, whether you're representing the organization. Yes?
Kara, we have someone from our chat, and they are part of an LGBTQ organization, and the project director is wondering, does that mean we are going to lose our 501c3 due to the new political administration?
I think the question was, how's the new administration going to deal with nonprofits? So I think I might touch on that at the end because it's very unclear, and especially because he says a lot of things we don't know what it means. So I think that might be a good point at the end about talking about some of the, and I have nonprofits asking me all this time. I'm like, I don't know. It's hard to say, but we'll kind of talk about some of the least rumors that he's saying, and we'll see if we could figure it out. But that's, oh, sorry, go on.
Just one clarification about you can do anything you want in your personal life. The place where that intersects and how many people that here it affects, but if you actually are a registered lobbyist for a nonprofit, during legislative session, you cannot give to candidates.
Right. Right.
That's that one exception when your work life sort of impinges on
That's
your
true.
speech as a person. You're not allowed to donate to candidates during the legislative session.
Exactly. So there might be other rules like that's just saying if you're a registered lobbyist, you have certain rules where you can't donate to candidates.
You can't buy anybody anything.
Yeah, exactly. So there's lots of rules when you're registered as a lobbyist. There's also just rules like for your employment. So you might have your day job. There's lots of rules about what you can and cannot do on your job, what you can and cannot be fired for. So, but the key thing is, as an individual, when you're not representing your nonprofit or if you have another employment or doing anything, you have a First Amendment right to voice your political beliefs. And you just need to be careful that they're individual and you don't want to do it while you're acting on behalf of your organization. Yes?
Well, I'm clergy, so I'm not sure I have that personal protection. Like, there's not a point at which I'm not that.
I understand.
I don't turn that off at 5 p.m.
Yeah, I understand that.
That's my identity. So I suppose I could, if really pressed, say I'm speaking as my own person versus the church.
That's the safe thing to do.
Very few people see that.
I understand.
You know what I mean? Like it's more messy than an executive director of a nonprofit for whom they may not have that job in a year.
Yeah.
Right? They may be associated with that organization, but okay.
I absolutely understand, and that is something where to help yourself, you say, well, individually or personally. I mean, those are the ways you do it. But there's been cases where I can't remember the name of the man. It's been a while ago, but the Focus on the Family organizations down in Colorado Springs, where they had a church and the Catholic Church has this too. They have the Catholic Bishops Council, which is not a C3. So lots of times the way religious organizations do it is they have kind of affiliated political organizations, or what I call C4s, which are lobbying organizations. And in the Focus on the Family case, that was one of the few cases where they tried to bring something against a minister standing up and saying something. And he was like, no, I was speaking with my C4 hat, not my C3 hat. And it worked. So I get it, but it also does, help for you to say, this is just my personal belief.
I find this such a great area because there have been on social media, there have been posts from the ACLU and the NAACP where they are clearly siding with one party.
Uh-huh.
How does that work?
Well, if you're looking at some of that social media, these groups have what are called affiliated organizations. So ACLU has a 501c4 social welfare organization, which all they do is lobby. But, and I have lots of clients with these kind of setups, and then lots of them will have affiliated PACs. These are about 501c3s, sorry for people on the listening in, about, if you're seeing things from the ACLU, other groups posting, they're very clearly posting under their C4, but sometimes it's hard to tell who's posting. So I always tell people when you have these, a C3 and a C4, be clear which organization, because they often share employees. So there might be a C3 or a C4, whether, even with like Catholic Church and the Catholic Bishops Conference, which is a C4. They're just going to be very clear about, here I am individually, here I am on behalf of my C3, or here's the C4 messaging is. So when you're seeing those things, you're probably seeing it from the C4. Yes?
Are you going to get into clarifying like position statement versus lobbying?
Yes, I am. Okay. That's the whole second half of it. Sorry, we'll be talking about what exactly lobbying is.
We're talking about which hat. I think for us, it's more looking at a position.
Yeah. And that's really important because lobbying is a very technical term. So I'm going to continue talking a bit more about what is or isn't indirect participation in a campaign, which is prohibited, and then we'll move into the lobbying section. And they're very different. So it's kind of, lobbying is allowed by C3s, just to a certain limited portion, whereas what I'm talking about now is completely prohibited. So I want to kind of get through the complete prohibitions first, and then we'll talk about what is lobbying under the tax code. So again, the IRS, they just said, we don't really know if it's indirect participation in a campaign. We just know it when we see it. So it's hard. That's a lot of my work, is kind of people say, can we do this? And I'll be like, part of it's just a judgment call. But there's some things you're allowed to do as a C3. You're working within the campaign, within people running for office, but you're not being partisan. And one of that is what's called voter education activities. So 501c3s are absolutely allowed to educate the voters about people's position on something, or how they voted in the past, or what their position is on your particular issue, or what the position is on, or how they voted in the past session, as long as you're doing it in a nonpartisan manner. And that's the tough part, to do it in a nonpartisan manner. Because I look at a lot of these things where groups will send out voter education guides to their members or put them on their website. And here's a really good example. If you're a pure conservation environmental group, and you just put out the candidate's view on the environment, we all know what you're trying to say because you're an environmental group. And if you see like this particular candidate votes no on all the environmental things, and this one votes yes on all the environmental things, this is seen as indirect support of the candidate that's pro-environment because of the context of the communication, because you're an environmental group. So that's seen as indirect participation. So when groups want to do this, I tell them, you have to ask about a lot of issues, including those that are not your own. So you have to put out a kind of a fully beefed up guide to vote, to educate your members about what people's policies are. So I'll tell groups like, put in something about tax policy, put in something about foreign policy. Like, you can't just ask about your issue, because then people can tell indirectly who you're trying to promote. So if you're putting out any information about candidates, it has to be nonpartisan. That means you have to ask all candidates to reply. If only like Republicans reply, you can't put it out. You have to at least get a good sampling of them. And you have to put it in a context where if you're just reading it, you're not kind of being swayed by everything to support or oppose a particular candidate. Yes? One political party doesn't respond. Right. So if you want to do some of this nonpartisan voter education, I'm talking about what this means if only one party responds. Lots of times people put out questionnaires, or you might invite people to a town hall or to come and talk about things. You need to get a good sampling of the people running in order to put it on. If you're putting out something and you only get Democrats responding, you can't put it out, because this would it would look like indirect support of Democratic candidates. If you're putting on a town hall and only Republicans show up, or what if there's 5 candidates running for something and only 2 show up? These are the things where, again, it's hard. There's no black and white guidelines about this, but you have to be really careful, because again, the context is you're educating people on the election or on the candidates in a nonpartisan manner. And therefore, the whole context of what you're doing has to be nonpartisan in terms of the questions you ask, in terms of how you ask them. When I look at lots of the questionnaires that go out, it's amazing how much I find what I call loaded questions. They have to be very kind of like open-ended, like I said, what's your view on this issue versus what do you, a lot of it's just writing skills to. Right. Well, I'm talking about like when you're trying, that's the thing, you can't. So the idea is you get back information that you respond, and if you don't get enough information, you can't put it out. You just can't. Or you find a 501c4, they'll put it out for you. Yes?
You're not asking questions, you're just
actually saying what someone else said or how they voted on.
And that's fine as long as you do it for like everyone who is running, if they have that record, and you just do very kind of, here's what they, here's the legislation, here's who voted for it, here's who didn't, and that's it. That would be nonpartisan. It's factual, and it's, yes or no.
So I've seen C3 organizations all the time, specifically environmental ones, say, this piece of legislation is coming out, your senator has said X, call them and tell them not to do that.
Okay, that's lobbying, which is okay. So again, we'll talk about that in a second, but be very clear, there's a difference between supporting or opposing candidates and doing lobbying, which is okay.
My question is, what's the difference between that and just saying, your senator said X, right?
I'll tell you what it is.
Yeah.
Timing. Timing. I advise a lot of clients in Colorado. The legislative session ends, May 10th, something like that. Right after the session ends, all the 501c3s, and you could do this, that engage this, put out here's what everyone did. And you could be nasty, and you could be like, look at what they did, and they voted against our kids and whatever. The reason you could do that is there's no election that's coming up, or even if there's one in November, you just finished the session, you're talking about what they did historically already. So it's a trick. This is all very fun and tricky. That's why people have to call me. But the idea is that if you're putting out something after the legislative session saying, call your senator and tell them you didn't like how they voted on that, education bill, the vote already happened, so it's not lobbying, right? Because the legislation passed or did not pass. The session's over, so no lobbying. And the prohibition is to support or oppose candidates for public office. Well, like this year, who's up for an election in 2017? Right, but not like the governor, not like your representative. So, in an off election year, I did air quotes on that for the people on the phone. There's a lot of work you can do because there's no election coming up. Now, the problem is, as we all know, is kind of everyone's always running for office all the time. So this is when it gets gray. So, who knows? They're already talking about who's going to be trying to run for governor, but it's still in the early stages. And that's why timing is really important. So right after the legislative session in May and June, that's when you have a lot of freedom to go back and tell your members or post on your pages, here's what people voted for. We don't like it. We think this is bad legislation, but you're not lobbying because the legislation either passed or didn't. So it's already in the past. And you're not supporting candidates because there's no candidates because there's not an election. So this is all very technical stuff. I know it's very odd. I think it's really interesting. It's actually in the tax code. So I'd have to say it's probably the most interesting part of the tax code. If anyone's ever had a chance to look at that. So it's really fast. It's very interesting. And this is, you'll see, and I'll tell you this, if I forget at the end, there's a group called Alliance for Justice or Boulder Advocacy online, and they have amazing cheat sheets. And so that's a really good place. If this is a little too technical, my outline, their website has amazing stuff for nonprofits to just kind of give you this information in a very kind of general way. But Boulder is BOLDER advocacy.org. So BOLDER advocacy.org is an amazing organization that helps nonprofits learn how to lobby. So you could call them sometimes, although it's hard to reach them. They put out lots of great information, but as I think you'll figure out, you could read all these sheets and I could tell you all these things, but the questions still sometimes are, yeah. Yeah, they're better by email. Yeah. Yeah, so they do great things. And I've done webinars with them as well. The problem is sometimes they can't give you a good answer because they're not your lawyer. So they'll have to be like, they won't give you very specific legal advice, but they're really helpful. Another thing nonprofit C3s can do are voter registration drives, get out the vote drives. We kind of pass this, so I won't talk too much but the key on this issue, but the key thing is you actually have to get out the vote for not based on political party, but based on being nonpartisan. And the interesting thing is the IRS and the rule is you're allowed to getting out the vote in a nonpartisan manner means you can't just go get out the vote in what you know are Democratic neighborhoods, or you can't just go get out the vote in what you know are Republican neighborhoods. You have to just pick your area of getting out the vote in a nonpartisan way. That's much more tricky than it sounds. You are allowed to get out the votes just for what are called underrepresented voters. So you can go just get out the votes on African Americans. You could just get out the votes on the Latina communities. and younger people, youth, I guess, because they're considered to be underrepresented. And so it's interesting because there's actually a case where some 501c3 groups are doing get out the votes only on African American communities in the past 8 years. And statistically, those communities voted 98% for Obama. But because they're underrepresented communities, it was still considered to be nonpartisan get out the vote. So it's really interesting where I think it's much more difficult to kind of, you know, because you can't, in terms of what's an underrepresented community, like it's hard. Like the IRS has said a few things, homeless people are underrepresented communities, but you can't say we're going to go get out white men in this factory town or things like that. So it's an interesting topic. I mean, if you do voter registration, get the vote drive, it's very technical. I wouldn't do it without specific advice. So again, I think the important point I'm going to leave you with on this candidate-related side is C3s are specifically prohibited from supporting or opposing candidates for public office. Again, that's can mean a lot of things. It's a loaded saying. Candidates run from the president to the governor to the senators to your school board and to the RTD offices because they're running for public office. You could educate people in a nonpartisan manner. What happens if you're caught for violating this rule, otherwise known as the Johnson Amendment? Technically, you could lose your tax-exempt status. You could also face a lot of fines. In the past 5 years, I don't know if anyone's gotten more than a hand slap. Not saying you should do it, but I think it tends to be, and I advise my clients, it's more of a media issue. It's more of your opponents on maybe the other side of your issue or coming up to the media. It could look very bad in the media. So lots of times the advice when we're dealing with the Internal Revenue Service is that because they have very few people to enforce these rules, sometimes that's not the biggest concern, but having it flash, you know, above on the front page of a newspaper would probably really hurt your organization. So it's really important to understand that. But you can, in theory, lose your tax-exempt status and also have what's called an excise tax. And if people gave you money, their donations, which were originally tax deductible, may become retroactively non-tax deductible. So there's some pretty harsh penalties. Okay, now with that, let's move on to lobbying. And it's important to distinguish between lobbying and partisan campaign or candidate-related activities because, you know, candidate activities cannot do it at all, complete and prohibition on those activities. With lobbying activities, public charities are allowed to engage in them, but you can only engage in a limited amount. So that's why it's important to understand what exactly is lobbying, and if you are lobbying, how to measure it so you don't exceed your lobbying limitation. And just to be very clear, private foundations, which none of you are, and CNDC is not, are not allowed to engage in any type of lobbying. A private foundation, examples of some of the bigger ones, well, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Colorado Trust, the Colorado Health Foundation, private family foundations, lots of them are the ones that will make the grants out to your organizations. The difference between a private foundation and public charity, very specifically, is a private foundation usually doesn't need to raise money from the general public because somehow they got a large endowment either through a wealthy family or for some other reason that they invest their endowment, you know, make money off of it, and then they make grants out to public charities. And there's various policy reasons why private foundations can't donate. A good example is the Clinton Foundation and the Trump Foundation. Those are both private foundations. And the reason why they have stricter rules is they're seen to be controlled by, you know, families, and therefore they're more potentially likely to be subject to abuse. Whereas public charities have board members who are from the community, and therefore they're less likely to be subject to abuse. So you all and the CNDC are all public charities, but this is important because if you ever get, you know, go out and get your own C3 status, or you're trying to seek a grant from a private foundation, you'll often see language in their grant agreement saying you can't use this money to lobby because they can't do it. Yes?
Sorry, I have a question. And it has to do with private foundation, but also has to do with pooling resources.
Mm-hmm.
Because once I was working at a different job and we had a restricted funder, Walton Foundation,
Right.
didn't do anything with that, was sole funding for the project. But then we got a few more sources of funding. Once we had that, we were able to lobby because we were able to say, well, we're not funding with
Right.
Walton, and we're also not
Right. So the question is about receiving private foundation funding, and that might be restricted. I work with a lot of private foundations on this issue, and I'll just say it briefly because it's a very kind of complicated answer. Private foundations can give a general operating grant, and you can use it for whatever. But if they specifically say you can't lobby with it, you can't. But as long as you're using funds from other sources, it doesn't matter. So private foundations are usually, especially the big ones, astute about this. But when you get a grant agreement, there's going to be some language saying you can or cannot, it might say you can't lobby with it. They're all going to say you can't use it for partisan purposes, which you can't do anyways. But you have to look at that language when you get that money. And if you can't use that money for lobbying, you can't do it. You need other funds to do that. Yeah.
So we're going to talk in the end about coding for lobbying expenses, particularly as it relates to grants that also are unrestricted funds. So we'll have that conversation.
Yeah, that's a very part of it's just how you're coding and how you put your bank accounts and how you account for your different money in terms of whether your funds are restricted. And restricted funds very generally just means funds that you can only use for a certain purpose. But private foundations often put not only do you have to use it for this program, but you can't use it for lobbying. I mean, that's because they can't lobby. Okay, so let's talk about what exactly lobbying is, because I think lots of people don't know what that means, or rather they do, but the tax code has a specific definition. And the definition of lobbying, the tax code is very, very specific, and it's not the same as someone mentioned they're a registered lobbyist. Completely different rules from state and federal lobbying rules. So I just want to be very clear, because I think that word gets thrown around a lot. And what I try to teach, the people I advise my clients is use the term advocacy for when you're doing something that doesn't quite meet to the tax code standard of what's lobbying, because that helps you think about it. Because people say I'm advocating for this or I'm lobbying, and if they don't kind of know how to do it, I like to use those terms to distinguish, advocacy from lobbying as defined by the Internal Revenue Code. So lobbying specifically means under the code, the expenditure of money by an organization for the purpose of attempting to influence legislation. So we're going to go through what each of these points mean. And I might want to hold questions until I get through this definition, because there's a lot in here. So you're going to attempt to influence legislation if you advocate for the adoption or rejection of legislation. Then there's something called direct lobbying, which is a specific type of lobbying. Then there's grassroots lobbying, so we'll talk about that. And there's also lobbying in terms of dealing with ballot referenda, which we have a lot of here in Colorado, obviously. So this is about to be a big conversation as of the past few days. What is legislation? Everyone go back to I had it in 11th grade civics. Someone told me they don't teach this in public school anymore, which is horrifying. But remember, we have 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, judicial. Legislation comes from the legislative branch. Comes from Congress. It comes from Congress. We're going to talk about this because of executive orders, but hold off executive orders to a section. I'm going to do my normal talk, and then we'll talk about executive orders. So it has to come from a legislative body, because legislation has to come from the legislative body. Now, so legislation does not include actions by judges. So lots of people will talk about if there's a case before the Supreme Court, lots of people will go out and try to do something, not that they listen, but that's not lobbying, because it's about a court. That's in the judicial branch. And then there's the executive branch, which includes the governor, mayors, but it also includes, and this is really important for you to understand, what are called administrative agencies. Administrative agencies form what are called administrative or regulatory rules. They are not legislative bodies. You could talk to them all you want. This is very big when you're dealing with departments of education, health. I mean, this is a huge important exception that you need to understand about, because it's not legislative. Yes?
I'm on a working group right now with city council writing rules. So people could fund me, and that doesn't have to, they don't have to worry about.
Well, let's hold off city council. Hold off city council.
It's the administrative division
right.
Of
right.
Excise and waste.
Right. So correct. If you're doing administrative rules, not legislation. So lots of people who are working in healthcare, with HICPA for the things, not legislation. Yes?
So we provide a lot of expert testimony to administrative bodies like Bureau of Land Management, EPA, region. So that's obviously
not lobbying.
That's obviously fine, not lobbying. because it's testimony and it's to the executive agency. But then what we'll do is tell our legislators about that experience, right? We'll say, we testified to the Bureau of Land Management about the changes in coal plans. And here are the things that are being proposed, here's what we said. That still skirts the line of educating our legislators, right?
Not lobbying. Not lobbying. And that's why this is really important that you understand the definition, is because there's so many things you could do that's not lobbying. School boards, not lobbying. And I work with lots of clients involved in the health arena. So, talking with government agencies about, or, EPA, not lobbying. So it's really important to understand. Now, here's the city council issue. City councils, and this happens a lot in Denver, sometimes have both legislative and executive powers. So Denver City Council both is an executive council and it also passes laws. So what this lovely lady in the front was just talking about is that when your city council is working on regulatory or administrative rules, they're acting, because it's not legislation, because it's administrative rules, they're not acting in a legislative capacity. But so sometimes you have to get really careful, and sometimes I don't know the answer because I don't know how these things work. So part of it's just really trying to go back to your civics class and try to figure out what they're doing. And oftentimes I have to go look at their charter and see exactly what they're doing because it's difficult to understand. And this is similar with I think RTD and some of those other types of boards. You're like, what are they? And so part of it's just trying to figure out where their grant of authority comes from, what they're doing, and whether they're legislative or not. So that's really an important thing. So again, and here's another exception besides the city council exception you have to worry about is, so the executive branch, say talk about Colorado, it's easier right now, like our governor, he is in the executive branch, he cannot legislate. But all of a sudden he gets legislative authority if he has a chance to veto a bill. So if you start doing some messaging to Governor Hickenlooper, veto this bill, all of a sudden you're lobbying because because he has the ability to veto the legislation, he's acting in his legislative authority. Does that make sense? It's a lot of, again, going back to the details of figuring out how our government works. And even as a lawyer, where you kind of get trained on this very specifically in law school, I always forget and have to kind of go back and look at. But usually the governor or the executive can't legislate, except when they have the chance to veto a bill, and that's when it changes. Yes?
So if the governor puts into statute a group of individuals to form a commission, what is that?
So with commissions, so what happens if the governor sets up a commission? I've had to check the legal charters of the commissions. Generally, I would say no, because lots of times what commissions do is they kind of recommend big policy pictures. So generally I'd say no, but sometimes they're asked to come out and recommend specifically worded legislation. So
are they an administrative body? Is that
yeah, if it's a governor appointment, commissions are legislative bodies, but sometimes the legislature will appoint a commission too. So this is where you really have to figure out what you're dealing with. If it's a governor's commission, it's an executive commission, but sometimes the Congress will set up their own commission with the goal of coming out recommending legislation, and that might be lobbying. So all I could say, it's very complicated. This is when you could very much call Alliance for Justice or me, and but it's really kind of figuring out what's this body that we're talking about. And sometimes it's not so easy to figure out if it's an executive or legislative branch. Usually, if it's an executive branch, you're usually okay. But it's hard to say because you don't know. And some of these bodies, it's very unclear unless you kind of really know, the Colorado Constitution in great detail, which I have to say, I think none of us do. And that's why calling Alliance for Justice might not be very helpful when you're dealing with Colorado issues, but you could call me. So let's just talk about something I've always said this, and I've never really had to pay too much attention to it, but in the past few days, I just got 30 million questions. Presidential executive orders. I kind of assume well, of course, it's coming from, here's my, lecture. I do this all the time. It's the executive branch. it's not legislation. But I want to make sure, because I'm like, I don't really know how this works, and I never paid too much attention. So I had to kind of dig through a bit more to see exactly how it works. And I think as a rule of thumb, I'd say generally it's not legislation. So I have some clients who are immigrants' rights groups. And needless to say, I'll get all these questions in the past few days. Like, can we go say, don't do this? Or call your congressperson to tell them not to help, build a wall, or various types of things. Well, so this is the complication. This is where it gets really tough. The executive order itself is not legislation. That's an executive order. But in order to actually build the wall, there needs to be a congressional appropriations law to fund it. I'm not going to tell you the answer because I don't know the answer, but I think this makes logical sense. So far, there's no appropriations bill, right? As far as I know. I mean, part of it's just I need to know my politics, or I need to ask my clients to give me a much better example of what's going on. And it moves so fast these days. But because there's no bill right now in front of Congress, as far as I know, to appropriate that money, it's probably okay. But if there was a bill in Congress for that budget appropriation to implement the executive order, that would be probably indirect lobbying. So it's complicated, and that means you have someone who's really staying abreast of everything that's going on. So just an executive order, it's probably not lobbying, but if there's a pending bill, and we'll talk about this more, in Congress that would implement the executive order, I think the answer is, I think so, yeah. Well, again, this just means it would be lobbying, which is not okay. Right. Yes.
I also want to point out that he said Mexico's going to pay for the wall.
Right. And maybe listen, because we're going to talk about exactly what a few other rules here about what is legislation that will get into some of these things. Because I never really had to go into this much detail on executive orders because no one knew, no one would do this. But we'll talk about that. Yes.
I'm a little confused. I think you said we could lobby. Lobbying is attempting.
Yeah. So again, you can lobby, but I need to tell you what the question is. We're confused about whether you can or cannot lobby. You can lobby, but only to a limited amount.
Right.
And so what I want to tell you is what is and isn't lobbying. And then what the point is then you'll be able to kind of figure out what your budget is. So you figure out what money you have to allocate towards lobbying, what you don't. So again, you're allowed to lobby. It's just you need to know what lobbying is before you could figure out how much you can do. Yes? That's a big point, let's go there. Let's go there now. Yeah, let's go there now, because again, let's look at the definition of lobbying. We're going to talk. There's so many points about what is lobbying, and one of it is the point of what's education versus lobbying. So again, the first thing is we need to have legislation, and we're only on the first point. What is legislation? It has to come from the legislative branch. And so executive orders are not legislation, but you have to be aware if there's some kind of pending legislation at the same time. Because here's the example I just honestly had yesterday from a client from an immigrants' rights group. Is they want to say, can we put out messages to our members to call your congressman and tell them not to support the executive order to build the wall? And so the answer is yes, you could do that. That's not lobbying because there's no legislation there. But if tomorrow all of a sudden a bill goes before Congress where they're appropriating money for that, the exact same message would probably become lobbying, even though indirect.
What if we just vaguely say
Yeah, keep waiting. Now wait. Yeah.
Just released,
Yeah, no, there's ways, right. Right, so let's get into this. So we went through legislation. What we also need, before there to be lobbying, we need legislation, but we also need what's called specific legislation. So this is where it's starting to get really complicated. Specific legislation, what is that? So the easy answer is when we're involving ballot measures, like in Colorado, there's no specific legislation until the petitions start to circulate to get it on the ballot. That gives nonprofits, including private foundations, which can't lobby, tons of time to get something on the ballot. So there's a lot of work to get legislation titled, to get support, to educate, to do all these things. But until the ballot gets titled before the titling board and petitions circulate, There is no specific legislation. There is no lobbying. This is really important for private foundations because they can't lobby at all. So as soon as that day the petitions go out, private foundations pull away, and public charities, they don't necessarily pull away, but all of a sudden what wasn't lobbying might become lobbying in terms of how they code their funds. Yes. 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 Yeah. So basically they're controlled by a corporation, or they're not fundraising. They're not fundraising is, I think, the simplest way of describing it. Gates Family Foundation, Gates Foundation here. They're the organizations with a lot of money that usually make grants out to organizations like yours.
Interesting that Colorado Foundation used to be able to lobby.
Yeah, they changed status.
They changed status.
Right. Yeah. So that's kind of the thing, lots of, like, especially the health foundations, they'll do a lot of stuff. And we'll go into this in detail about talking about what should be on the ballot or what they'd like to see legislation, like all these different things, but it's not specific legislation. So again, we're talking about what is specific legislation, because if it's not specific, you're not lobbying. Yes?
So I feel like I should have taken more attention to civics.
Don't. Yes.
So the executive order is more like the new president's agenda of everything that he's going to bring up to Congress.
No, and I actually had to research this. I never paid attention. An executive order is the president saying, do this.
So it doesn't mean it doesn't have any.
It's not legislative. And therefore, lots of them, just because everyone's hearing about them now, if the Senate often, or the Congress action, has to pass legislation to implement it, because for like building the wall, sorry, they're talking about what's an executive order for people on the phone, there's no money.
Right.
So Congress has to pass a bill to give, I guess, the appropriations bill to give the money to build the wall. So it's basically him directing administrative organizations like ICE, the immigration, can't remember. Yeah, so he's telling the federal agencies to do something. But oftentimes they can't do anything because there's no money to do it unless Congress gives them the money to do it. Yeah. Yeah, so that's kind of an executive order is the president. I don't even know if our governor can do it. Executive orders are very interesting. It can get, it does mean a lot because, yeah, right. So an executive order, and I'm not going to say I'm the expert on this because I do feel like I need to go. And I talked to my law partner who's a constitutional attorney. So I do have some background on this in terms of the Constitution. It really is.
Obama expanded like LGBT inclusion for executive.
The president can do lots of executive orders, and sometimes they mean something and sometimes they don't, because the order usually goes to administrative agencies. It often depends on whether the agency can do it within existing laws and budgets or not. So if the agency can do things like change hiring for LGBT groups, they don't need to change the law for that, and they don't need to change the budget because it's an order that works as is. But for example, the executive order to build the wall, that requires trillions and billions and trillions of dollars that we don't have. So unless Congress passes a bill to support that order, the administrative agency has to do that within their existing funds. And then one more question on this, and then we'll move on because it's very, yeah.
He is blocking funding to countries that have family,
Mm-hmm.
can't remember, but family care.
Yeah.
Where they support
The Hyde Amendment, yeah.
Where they have abortion. Where he's blocked that, that can go into action, right? Because it's not.
Yeah, this is a question about the Hyde Amendment where Trump, but you know what? It wasn't Trump. The Hyde Amendment allows for U.S. funding to organizations that engage in family planning outside the U.S. It doesn't fund abortions. It funds family planning.
Right.
But I don't know if that's an executive order that he signed. I think it might have been legislation because all the congressmen were standing behind him. I might be wrong.
So
It was?
The gag rule part of the
Yeah.
executive order. So the
Yeah.
Hyde Amendment allowed this to happen for these monies to
Okay.
be distributed. And then the
There's-
executive
right.
order is you people acting on behalf of the United States
Mhm.
can say X,
Okay.
Y, and Z now, or cannot say.
Okay, so there's a lot more experts on this particular thing because again, part of it you just have to watch it and pay attention, and if you don't, so what's an executive order and what's legislation? It's confusing. And then once you determine whether, let's assume there is legislation, and we are talking about the legislative branch, what's specific legislation? So I know it's going to cause a lot more confusion. Again, the easy one is Colorado and ballot measures. Need to start the petition circulating. In Colorado, when we have a ballot measure or constitutional amendment, anything that the people vote on, There is no specific legislation until the title board titles it, which is usually the day before, and then the petitions to get it on the ballot circulate. So when you have people coming up to you at the store saying, sign this petition, right then there's specific legislation when petitions are circulating. For example, you'll see lots of groups or nonprofits trying to be like, we want to get this on the ballot in 2 years. All the work trying to get something on the ballot is not lobbying, because there's no specific legislation until it gets titled. So that's really important to understand. Now, here's the complicated thing. Oh, there's one more question in the back.
Do you ever mention general obligation bonds when they're on the ballot? Like, are they as
Yeah, if they're on the ballot, general like bonds, mill levies, any of those things, if it goes before the people, it's that would be lobbying. Any vote for this bond, vote for this general, anything that, yeah, we'll talk about that, because that's one of the exceptions to lobbying, is how you educate about legislation without lobbying. So we'll get to that. That's really another huge, important exception. I'll do one more question, then we'll just kind of scoot around a bit, then maybe we should hold them a bit so we can keep going through.
I'll direct this to Nard, that we do quite a bit of work with Alaska Natives and other tribes and their sovereign nations, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, I've never had that question specifically, and this involves doing work with sovereign nations, which are not under federal government. They're sovereign, and right. So they're not right. So I would imagine if you're directing it to, I think that's what you're looking at. If you're, I don't know how it works, so I don't want to be ignorant about this, but if there's a council that passes legislation, that would be lobbying to them. Yes. So even though they're a sovereign nation, you're still looking at what body are you speaking to? Do they have the capacity to pass law? Because it's still law in their nation, even if it's not part of federal or state statute. All right. So specific legislation for ballot issues is when the petitions start to circulate. When's it specific? When it's going to the legislature? You're just a few blocks away. Unclear. The IRS used to have a timing for it, and they took it out. And this is highly problematic. What happens is, and I had to learn this as well, you know, how a bill becomes a law, but someone will bring a bill forth. They'll get like a House bill, whatever number. And certainly once that happens, there's specific legislation. But it's probably specific a lot earlier than that. And this is where it gets really problematic. Specific legislation, it has to be more than just kind of ideas circulating. It has to be people are really talking about it and they're starting to write it or draft it. And I work with lots of private foundations on this issue, because lots of groups want to go like, hey, let's talk some like healthcare stuff. We see that these types of rules really would help children in terms of school to get healthier. So we'd really like to see some legislation directed at more physical education or less sugar or something like that. That's not specific legislation. It's lots of ideas. But when a legislator takes that idea and starts drafting it up and asks you to be like, hey, help me draft this, there's probably specific legislation and it's lobbying. So you have to kind of be careful. You have to understand what's going on in the Capitol, because, and again, this is just to determine whether you are or not lobbying, because again, you can lobby, it's just determining it. But if you're just asking people like, this is important, we'd like to see this, or you hear some rumors that someone might bring a bill, there's no specific legislation yet, but at a certain point, there's going to be specific legislation. It's hard to figure out when that is. And you really have to have your ear to the ground or know what's going on inside the Capitol to understand if there's specific legislation.
Legislature holds a stakeholders meeting and gets people together focused on an issue.
Yeah.
In anticipation of.
Yeah, but I would say there's no specific legislation then. But if someone says, I'm drafting this, it's probably specific. And it's very gray. And the Internal Revenue Code, or I guess it's Congress, you know, specifically pulled out these rules about when there's a black and white line. So it can be complicated. And sometimes I can't give my clients the answer because I don't know what's going on inside the Capitol. So that's important to note. Should I talk about it now? Let me, wait, it's on my next page. We talk about two different types of lobbying, and then we'll get to the education phase because that's really important. And it looks like I have more than enough time, so we're running out of time. So there's two types of lobbying, and this is important because you have to code differently for these things. One's called direct lobbying and one's called grassroots lobbying. And this is pretty easy in terms of everything else. It's pretty black and white. Direct lobbying is when you're actually talking to the person making the decision on the specific legislation. So you're directly telling the person who's going to vote on it, vote yes on this, vote no on this. Now in Colorado, that means talking to the legislature, talking to the governor if he has the ability to veto something, but very importantly, with all of our ballot measures, is talking to the general public. So anytime you're saying vote no on amendment XYZ, vote yes on this bond measure, direct lobbying, because you're talking to the people. It's the people who get a vote on it on the ballot. Now, if you call up your congressperson and say vote yes on this, because you're directly talking to the person who's going to vote on the measure, that's direct lobbying. Now, the other one is grassroots lobbying, which means you say, contact your congressperson and tell them XYZ. So there's this call to action in it where you're not directly contacting the person who's going to be voting on the issue, but you're telling the general public, your members, you're telling them to contact the person who's voting on it. And that's grassroots lobbying. And that basically means, anytime you're giving someone the ability to figure out, and I see this a lot these days, here's Cory Gardner's number and email, contact him to say XYZ. That's grassroots lobbying. Versus vote yes on this ballot measure, which is direct lobbying, or you directly calling up a representative and telling them, to vote yes or vote no on something. And the reason why this is important is, like I said, C3s that are not private foundations can lobby, but there's limits. And there's different ways of calculating your limits based on whether it's grassroots or direct. So we'll get into that at the end, because if we have to cut off anything, it'll be how to calculate your H election, because no one likes to hear that. So that's really important to understand what's grassroots versus direct lobbying. And when you're timesheeting or coding things, they will have a differentiation. So part of it's just to understand how you're going to code things. Do you have a call to action? Contact this person. Or you don't even say you need to contact Cory Gardner. You could say contact your congressperson, but it's some way of telling them that and potentially giving them the ability to do it. Yes.
What about the form letters that people draft and put online and say,
yes,
you send that on? Is that in?
That's it's grassroots lobbying, because you're giving them the ability in some way, shape, or form to do it.
Even though in the letter they say, I'm your constituent, vote no on this. So the letter itself says that.
The money the organization spends to put that together counts as grassroots lobbying, because what you're doing is telling someone to download it, fill it out, and send it in. So that's why it's grassroots. So again, let's just, before we go into the education part, which is a huge part, you have to, first of all, spend money on supporting or opposing specific legislation. So we're kind of going through each of these bits. One of the things I didn't say is supporting or opposing. If you just say, contact your congressperson and tell them your views on this issue, but you don't tell them to support or oppose, not lobbying. Again, you have to be careful, because you could use kind of loaded language. But if you're like, these are really important issues, we just like you to speak your mind and let the people know your opinion on them, it's not lobbying, because you're not supporting or opposing legislation. So you have to be careful with this, because it's how you write it, but you also have to actually support or oppose legislation. Yes.
How you write it and who you say that? Because if you say it to a specific partisan group, is that lobbying?
It depends. This is where it's all the context, and it's not black or white. It depends. Lots of groups have membership lists, or they send out to their email list. So I think it's context. It's hard to say, but if part of it's just something where, and part of it's like what your issue is. Like, again, if you're just an LGBT group and there's something pending and you send it to them saying, contact them and let them know how you feel, I think just contact you, say, well, no, we know what you're trying to do. So that's a hard one, but oftentimes you can get things through that's not considered to be lobbying if you have a very kind of innocuous message about things, which often happens. Like in Colorado, you could do it like when the session's over, because there's no legislative session. So during the summer, you could be like, hey, we really want to see you put together some really good like healthcare legislation, or there's lots of things, or tell them that you think education is important to Colorado type of language, that if it's not in session, might work. Absolutely. Okay. So we try and talk to, one more question.
Maybe I missed this when you started this conversation.
clear that as long as we're tracking our time, we can lobby.
Yes.
Okay.
And maybe,
And so,
yeah.
And is there a specific portion of time that we are allotted in order to lobby?
Yeah.
So can you?
I'll say that really quickly, and it's, yeah, I'll frame it out, and then we'll get into the detail later.
Just I feel like I'm getting a.
Okay.
So as a nonprofit, I'm allowed to lobby, and I can direct lobby, and I can grassroots lobby, as long as I'm tracking my time.
Yeah, let's do this, and I'll tell the details about how to track it afterwards, which I kind of leave to the end. So nonprofits that are not private foundations can lobby, or nonprofits that are not part of governmental agencies. Some of them are, so let's, public charities can lobby. Generally, I'd say about 20% of your annual budget. And we're going to get into the details of this. So for the rest of the conversation till we get to there, just think if your budget's to spend $100,000, about 20% of that you could spend on lobbying. You could spend more of it on direct than you can on grassroots. So you could spend X on grassroots, X on direct, and we'll get into the more of the details at the end, because that's all your timesheets and coding, because this will go to like the CPA who does your tax return. So a lot of it is just understanding how to do this. So there's about 20% you could do. So again, that's why you need to know what's lobbying, but what's not lobbying. And as I think we'll all figure out, and what this has been leading to, is there's so much work here that is not lobbying. There's so much work. And again, the idea is, if you have a small budget, you don't want to, and if it's a particular issue and you only can spend 20% of your budget on it, you want to be very clear what you're spending on it and how you can maximize your advocacy, which again, I use that term to mean non-lobbying expenditures, and everything you could do around it. So you don't need to max out that, if you max out your 20%, you still can be engaged in advocacy on the issue. So this is the most important exception you should know. And this is a big one for the private foundations like the Health Foundation, the Colorado Trust. It's called, everyone's calling it the education exception. The IRS, the Internal Revenue Code, calls it the nonpartisan analysis, study, or research exception. I'm going to read it to you, and I'm sorry I'm reading the tax code to you, but I think it's good to read it first, and then we'll talk about what it means. So, a private foundation or a public charity may make available to the general public the results of, quote, nonpartisan analysis, study, or research, this is on a legislative issue, provided that such results present a sufficiently full and fair exposition of the pertinent facts to enable the audience to form an independent opinion. This is the education exception. And the idea is, as a C3, you're supposed to be charitable, scientific, or educational, and this is educational, but you can't provide an opinion in terms of vote for or vote against or support or don't support this. And this is where it gets tricky. But again, a C3 or a private foundation can educate the public about what the legislation says and its impact. You just have to be careful to do it in a way that you're allowing the person who's reading this to form their independent opinion. Now, I don't know if you guys know of the organization called Bell Policy Center, but they're like the best ones ever for doing this. If you want to go to their website, they're a C3 and they'll put out policy papers like, here's what this will do. And that's all they say, they put it out. Now, anyone reading it is going to develop their own opinion. But the idea is they're using facts. And I'll give another few examples and then we could talk about it more. The health foundations, which I work with, one of the health foundations is, what was it? I can't remember the name of the referendum, but the one for the universal health care we just had in Colorado. 69, that's right. So the Colorado Health Foundation, which is a private foundation, hired a healthcare law firm to put out a like 80-page paper about if it passed, the impact of it. If anyone got through it, because I could not get through it, and that's educational. It doesn't say vote no, vote yes. It doesn't say this is horrible. It says it's bad. It just here's what we think will happen. I'm seeing a lot of that with my healthcare organizations in terms of the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. If it's repealed, here's what studies will show will happen. And this is where nonprofits can offer so much help, be them private foundations or not, is that you could really say, hey, first of all, here's what it means in plain language. And here's what we think the impact will be. But you just have to be really careful and not use what I call, again, loaded language. And the idea is the facts will speak for themselves. And someone will read the facts and be like, I think this is bad or this is good legislation. Yes?
Is there a difference between advocacy and education?
I don't, again, I think the difference is, the question is there a difference between advocacy and education? I don't know. I think legally, as long as you know what legislation is under the tax code, the rest you could kind of define as you will. I think advocacy probably is education. Because again, our advocacy also might be talking about particular policy issues before legislation exists or before there's specific legislation. So again, in my head, when I think of advocacy, I think of, you know, let's try to get something on the ballot in 2 years. Let's try to get this out. Let's try to teach everyone why this is important, or here's a big policy issue. So again, education, part of this is talking about big policy issues. So healthcare policy, you could talk about that all you want, even with this potential repeal or the repeal of ACA going on. But you're not talking about the legislation, you're talking about the policy. And I kind of think that's advocacy, because you're talking about, you know, what you think is important for society, for big picture issues, policy issues, but you're not taking an opinion or a stand on specific legislation. And that's, I'm seeing a lot of the healthcare foundations doing this now, about we think it's really important that everyone has healthcare. That's not lobbying. It's a point on a specific policy issue, even though there's legislation going through on this issue right now.
As long as there's like no attached support for like HB.
You have to support or oppose legislation. Now the problem is with this is it can be indirect. So this is like, you can't, there's not like magic words like, you know, don't support this or support that. It can be much more indirect, and that's where it gets confusing, because if you use certain words, people can read it to understand what you're saying. Like, let's just say this. If you say repealing Obamacare will leave, you know, 40 million people without insurance and these many people will die, I would say that's indirect lobbying. Just because you know what, you know, if someone's saying that, you know what their view is on the legislation. Versus saying, you know, having health care for all is really important. And that, you know, it's a technique. It's a, you know, using your language and writing skills, and it can be difficult because lots of nonprofits, their goal really is to support or oppose legislation, but they can't do it because they don't have the lobbying limit. So, you know, a lot of it's just kind of making sure you really understand what you're doing. And again, educating the public or your Congress people or your legislator about policy issues, not lobbying. Educating them about what an impact of a bill will be, not lobbying, as long as you're not supporting or opposing it, because as long as you're doing educational. So lots of 501c3s are very like, do lots of research and study, and so they can make those results available to the public. So that's a really important thing.
Is there a spot if you are asked by a legislator to
Right.
testify in front of a committee?
Okay, there's 5 examples, four examples of exceptions for lobbying. The first and most important one is this education exception. You're providing educational information. And I could give tons of examples about this, but again, it's just, you know, go to the Bell Policy Center website. They do a lot of good things, but even, you know, environmental, any groups that just kind of say, here's the impact of legislation, you just kind of state it very factually. It's generally not lobbying, as long as you don't have some sort of coded, this is so bad, or, but you know, what's important when it's for, remember, direct lobbying is when you're talking directly to the person voting on it, and grassroots lobbying is when you have this call to action to tell people to vote. So, you know, that's the way you could be tricky, because if it's something that the Congress is going to vote on, and you say, you write out to your members, we think this is horrible legislation, you're not doing grassroots lobbying if you don't give them any way to, you know, have this call to action to contact someone. So there's a lot of little tricks involved here about how to get through this, because if you're not telling them to call someone, you're not grassroots lobbying, and if you're not providing, somehow getting it, you know, putting it on social media, you know, putting it in a way where you're directly contacting Congress, you're not doing direct lobbying. So, you know, there's lots of ways you could really get involved. And again, when I say advocacy, I pretty much means everything that doesn't, you know, fall under Internal Revenue Code definition of lobbying, which again is to expend money to support or oppose specific legislation. Yes.
Is the assumption then that the expenditure of time is the expenditure of money?
We'll talk a bit more about that when we talk about coding, but expenditure of money, if everyone's a volunteer, there's no time, right? If it's staff time, it's staff time. So yeah, I mean, lots of it, and that's the thing about social media these days and emails, so much cheaper. You do so much more. It's not like you're doing postage or printing things or buying ads. So expenditure of money really means, you know, buying the stamps or doing those things, or it means a person's time if they are if they're going to like post something on your website or send out an email and they're not a volunteer. And that's why you're doing the timesheets, is because that's like, here's the money coming in, and that's what you're trying to do, is figuring out what that expenditure is. Another exception to lobbying is what we just discussed, which is providing requested technical advice. So, but there's a little more of a trick to this. You need to receive a written request from the legislative body, not from a single legislator. That's written, but it has to be from the body, like not just.
Can it be like, this is Senator so-and-so on behalf of the Committee for Science and Technology?
I think so, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's not a specific person, that's just.
Right, it's the idea, it's not from just like, you know, a particular person, it's from the body, and they're asking you for technical advice. And yes, emails, writing. And that's just, again, I mean, that's kind of like the education exception. They're asking you to educate them on a particular issue. There's something called self-protection, and I shouldn't talk about it too much because it never works for anyone, even though people ask. But if there's some legislation that's going to like absolutely destroy your organization, and not because of money reasons. No, I know, but that's the thing. That's the trick. It's not money reasons. It's not like, oh, they're going to get rid of the treble tax deduction or something that would destroy a lot of nonprofits. It would actually be, and I can't even think of an example because I don't even know what it would be. But if you're actually going to have something that would just like personally towards your organization, that wouldn't be lobbying.
What about like a shelter that can lose funding because of the
It can't be for loss of funding. It can't be for loss of funding.
Violence Against Women Act goes away? They can't lobby?
No, it'd have to be something like you've lost zoning to have your shelter. You could lobby to get the zoning back or something. I'm trying to think. It's so.
Overlay planning district. Like,
Yeah.
let's say that Rhino decides it's going to institute all of these planning
Yeah.
requirements. All of a sudden, your use will not be.
Right. So it can't be funding related, or it can't be indirect like that. And that's what I'm saying. It's such a rare thing that I don't even think about. I've never seen any group be able to use it, except I would imagine it's something where it's like all of a sudden your building, you can't use your building for the intended purpose, or something kind of very specific like that. And we talked about this before, but this discussion of broad social issues. So even if there's pending specific legislation right now, as long as you're talking about the broad social issues and implications, you're not supporting or opposing specific legislation. So, you know, healthcare is, you see this going on right now. There's lots of discussions about just healthcare as general policy issues. That is not lobbying. And that's where, again, C3s and private foundations have a lot of ability to educate people about, actually, this is what happened. And actually, you know, this is people who don't have healthcare. This is how much healthcare costs, or this is pre-existing. I mean, it's just talking about these issues and educating people, which in a way lays the foundation for later lobbying if you're going to do that. And that's what lots of foundations do. I mean, the idea is you do all this work, this groundwork on educating people on the issues. And then to the extent you have this little 20% amount to lobby, you've already laid the groundwork so they understand why you're lobbying for it. So discussions of broad social issues are not lobbying. I'm going to give you a list of some non-lobbying activities, as much as one can come up with a list, but it's important. Again, educating legislators or the general public on broad social issues. Litigation is not lobbying. So I have lots of groups that will either litigate an issue or sign on as what are called amicus to different things. So litigation is not lobbying. Importantly, contact with executive branch employees and administrative regulations. So that's lots of school board work and, you know, working with administrative agencies in the executive branch. Influencing regulatory bodies. That's like the EPA or, you know, these administrative bodies. Again, not in the legislative branch. Lobbying by volunteers is not lobbying, except if you spend time organizing them and training them and assisting them to how to lobby, that's lobbying, because that's, if you're spending money on that, like if you're bringing in lots of bagels, well, so you could teach them how to do that, like those are the costs. But once the volunteers go out and lobby, you're not paying for that. Yes. Yeah, because they're volunteers. So again, remember, and we'll get a bit more to the expenditure, because that's kind of like the technical stuff at the end. And the key thing is to remember, again, there's a lot of, even when you're getting your volunteers, be it board members or otherwise, to go out and lobby, be it, you know, direct, you know, grassroots or however they're going to lobby. If a staff person who's paid is organizing it, their time counts. but not the volunteers' time. If you're reimbursing them for driving fees or things, that counts. But that's, you know, using volunteers to lobby is if you have lots of volunteers, that helps. Okay, training people how to lobby. So lots of private foundations like to do this. It's not a specific issue. There's just train, like, here's a really good way to lobby. Here's the best ways. Not talking about legislation, not saying go lobby on this issue, but just lobbying training is not lobbying. Producing, again, this nonpartisan research and analysis, such an important thing that nonprofits can do. It's putting out information, including about the specific legislation. One is you could just talk about the broad policy, but one saying, here is how repealing ACA is going to impact these people. And as long as you put it in a way that's very nonpartisan and factual, and let someone make their own decision based on it, that is not lobbying. And the last one is kind of what I tell private foundations is private foundations can't lobby themselves, but they can make nice big general operating grants to their grantees who can lobby. So even though they can't lobby, if they give you nice grants without that restrictive language, that's how private foundations can engage in lobbying, is by funding lobbying organizations. So let's talk a bit about the technical side about this, and then I think we'll probably be near the end and can open up for general questions. So again, public charities can lobby. There's something called the H election. Has anyone heard about the term the H election? It gets thrown around a lot. The H election is actually means under 501H of the Internal Revenue Code, and it's a tax election. And someone here is from a religious organization, from a church.
I mean, the nonprofit that a member of the CNDC represents an interfaith body, so we don't.
Okay, and the reason why I'm asking is some of these rules don't apply to like churches, synagogues, mosques, which is, so there's kind of a weird little, I sometimes throw it off to like different lecture because there's different rules. So that's why I want to know that. Okay. Okay. Because there's something called the H election, which with your Form 990, if you're filing it on your own, and you want to engage in lobbying, you have a choice to make what's called the H election, which is you file a form with your 990 saying, we want to lobby. You don't need to make that election. This is a new thing, and I think new, when you talk about Internal Revenue Code, might be 20 or 30 years, I'm not too sure, but it's something where if you make this H election, you come under this provision of the code that allows you to specifically calculate your lobbying limit, and it tells you how to do it. So generally I tell organizations you should do it. It's really good to make this H election. It tells you what is and what isn't lobbying. It tells you how to calculate it. It just gives you that safety. And you can make it. Now again, churches and temples cannot make this election. Certain entities cannot, but public charities can make this election. And the reason why you like to do that is because if you don't fall under this H election, there's something called falling under the other test, which is just meaning trying to figure out whether you're lobbying based on kind of some very unclear law. So generally, I say you would definitely want to make this election. It's really important to make the election so you could calculate your H election. Yes?
So to follow up on that, I was just thinking about this 20%. Is 20% of your total budget that we're lobbying?
Yes.
Let me talk about that.
Yes. Yes. So we're talking about an EIN. So whatever legal organization, so CNDC has the H election. Now I'm going to say something and hopefully it won't make you upset, but sometimes, like I said, I generally always tell people to make the H election unless you have assets, unless you want to spend, you have a lot of assets, like over $10 million in assets. Usually people don't, but some big organizations do. And so the reason why, and we'll talk about this in a second, is when you make the H election, you get maxed out. You can't spend more than $1 million a year on lobbying. So most organizations doesn't matter. But if you're a super large organization, like over $10, $50 million, like I think like American Cancer Society has it, they retracted their H election and now they're not maxed out at $1 million because they kind of follow under this other test, which I think is like 5 to 8% of your expenditures or budget. But if you have $50 million, that's going over $1 million. So again, if you ever have an organization with over $10 million, great, and talk about, think about not making the H election or revoking it because you can revoke it. But most organizations should make it just because it gives you a nice, you could follow it. It gives you kind of rules to follow. So again, you make the H election by filing what's called a Form 5768 with your Form 990, your annual tax return. So you don't need to do this now, but if you ever go off and become your own independent nonprofit, you could file this at any time and you can revoke it at any time, and it's super easy. It's 5768. And it's literally, you just kind of check a box. It's super easy form. You just file it with your 990. So for example, if you're independent and your Form 990, your annual tax return for 2016, it's not due until May 15th of this year, you can make the election for 2016 when you file your 2016 990 in a few months. So it's very easy to do. And basically it's in effect until you revoke it. And like I said, I've worked with some organizations who got big enough to revoke it. So what, again, the reason you have the H election is because it helps you calculate how much you could lobby. So I always tell people, you know, let's just think about 20% of your annual expenditures, your budget expenditures. And that's just a good kind of rule of thumb, but it's much more technical than that. And usually you need your bookkeeper. And what's really irritating is that you don't know what your expenditures are until the end of the year, right? It's not last year's expenditures. It's this year's expenditures. So it's kind of a moving target. So it's kind of a always changing and always moving because your budget's going to change, you're going to move, and you might get in a huge donation and all of a sudden it ups your budget. And so it's not, I think organizations that do this a lot, I always recommend kind of do your budget at the beginning of the year and kind of guess what it is, but you just kind of have to keep looking at it because it's going to move, which is really, I think people find it very irritating.
You know, I used to run an organization that lobbied a lot, and we had 4 staff that were registered lobbyists and a contract lobbyist. But because our legislative schedule is so short and because the definition of lobbying is so narrow, like we never even hit 5%, much less 20% of our budget.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a super high bar. Is my only.
Well, I mean, it's a super high bar if you have a big budget. If your budget's only 20,000 a year. So I mean, yeah, it could be, and it could be something. And I'll tell you a few little tricks when we kind of get through this. And it's in here, and again, this is something usually kind of the ED will look at, or, you know, along with the bookkeeper or CPA to kind of figure it out. But you kind of want to calculate at the beginning of the year to figure it out. But in my outline, you have to calculate like your total lobbying limit. So basically it's 20% of your first $500,000 of what are called exempt purpose expenditures. So that's expenditures related to your mission. So unless you're running a business or do something funky, let's say it's about 20% of the first $500,000 of your budget. So if you're an organization and your budget's $500,000, 20% of that, that's why I tell people 20%, you could use for lobbying. Yes?
For all funds or just eligible funds? You are getting private.
No, it's for all funds. So when you're talking about restricted funds, like funds you can't use for lobbying, that doesn't, when you're calculating your lobbying limit, you use all your funds. So even these restricted funds. So again, that's at least, even though you can't use those funds for lobbying, it goes into your calculation. So then, if after your first $500,000, if you go up and you actually have, you know, $1 million that you could spend each year, and that large, you have 20% of the first 500,000, 15% of the next 500,000, then 10% of the next 500, then 5%, and it caps at $1 million. So that's what I'm saying. Organizations that are really big, that would be capped at $1 million. You don't necessarily want to make the H election because it caps you. But what's important to know is that out of this money, when you come up with your total amount of your lobbying expenditure, or what I think the shorthand is your H election amount, is that only no more than 25% of that amount could count towards grassroots lobbying. And that's why you have to track what's grassroots versus direct lobbying. And I don't know why I think the idea is that direct lobbying is supposed to be somehow a better type of lobbying. Like if you're directly lobbying versus saying, go out and call your, you know, senator. But grassroots lobbying has a smaller limit. So within the amount you calculate, no more than 25% of that can be spent on grassroots lobbying. Let me just tell you what happens if you exceed the lobbying limit, and then we'll talk about some fun tricks, which is actually super important. Remember we talked about prohibited partisan politics, and you can't do that at all. Like none, you can't do it. So with lobbying, you can do it, and you could do it. And if you exceed your H election, which again, sometimes happens, because again, your budget kind of changes, like it happens. First of all, you'll just be taxed on the excess amount at like the corporate tax rate, which is 35%. So if your lobbying limit was $1 million, you spent $1,100,000, you have to pay tax. So, I mean, yeah, it sucks, but you're not going to get your exemption revoked. Also, and if you do it all the time, then you may get your exemption revoked because the IRS thinks you're kind of, ignoring the rules and doing it consciously. But if you happen to do it and groups do it, there's a tax. But another thing is it's kind of a rolling 4-year average. So they kind of look at, if you exceed your lobbying limit 1 year, it can go over to the next year and you might not have any lobbying that year. And I think maybe that's what the IRS or the code says to kind of help for the fact that it's really hard to actually calculate it. So there's a lot of kind of wiggle room here. So if you do exceed it, you could roll it over to the next year and then you have to do it under next year. So there's ways to work it out. You're not going to get your exemption revoked unless you continually exceed it, in which case, again, the IRS thinks you don't know what you're doing or consciously disregarding the law. One of the most important things I talk about with the organizations is really strategizing these rules, because there's a lot of strategy. And I'll talk about this and then we could kind of talk about with the organization and do some things. And I know you're all part of CNDC, but if you ever go out, especially if you're working for an organization that has a C3 and a C4, and let's use the ACLU since that was brought up, or if you're just a standalone C3 with an H election. So let's say you have $500,000 budget. That means you could spend 20% on lobbying. So it was just a big year. And let's say you spent 20% on lobbying and you didn't exceed it and you're fine. And now it's 2017 and nothing's going on in the legislature that's your particular issue, or it's just a quiet year. If you don't take that 20%, and you might not have the money, this is assuming you kind of have the money in the budget, you have 20% of lobbying funds that you're not expending on lobbying, which is going to waste. It doesn't roll over. There's no rollover. And again, the C3s have two options here. One is just don't worry about it because you need the money for other things. But if you have the money, you might not want to lose it. And because you can't roll it over, if you're a C3, a C4 organization, like again, the ACLU C3 can make a grant of that H election amount, that 20%, to its C4 or to another non-related lobbying organization. And the reason why this is important, there's a few things. So C4s, which are social welfare organizations, which basically engage in unlimited lobbying, they're tax exempt, but you could give them money, you just don't get a tax deduction, so they always have a harder time funding themselves. So when you have affiliated C3s and C4s, and there's so many of them, and they might not even be affiliated in terms of having an overlapping board or like an ACLU where it's interlocked, they might just be, there might be an issue that you're both, you just work closely together because there's an issue you like. If you have that money and you don't spend it, and you can grant it to a C4 and it counts against your H election, and you're helping fund an organization that doesn't have funding, and you might know in 2 years, in 2018, another ballot measure is going to be up. And so again, it tends to be with related organizations because they're connected. If you don't want to just send 20 grand to another organization, but it's something where it's really important to know, because if you don't, it's like if you don't use it, you lose it. And so if you ever don't spend your full H election amount and you're in an organizational structure that allows it and your budget allows it, it's good to make a grant to a C4. Any grant to a C4 will count against your lobbying election, and you've gotten rid of funds that someone else can use to lobby on an issue that you're going to be on the same side on. Yes?
Can the C3 just budget 20%? Like if it's a related organization where they have a C4 and a C3 branch, can they just have a 20% allocation to the budget that they just give to the C4 every year?
What often happens, because I work with a lot of organizations that do that, is the C3 and the C4 usually share staff.
Yeah.
And so often, I'm going to make this a little bit more complicated, but if the C3 and the C4 share staff and the payroll runs to the C3, if the C4 does not pay for its share of payroll, that share of payroll that it should be paying for counts against the H election. Let me say this in a different way because that was really confusing. I have lots of C3s and C4s, and we put together a cost sharing agreement where there's one building, one staff, insurance, whatever, and it's all run through the C3, because usually the C3 is more active organization, and the C4 kind of only activates when there's particular legislative policy. If the C4 needs to pay the C3 for its share of staff, and that's the whole reason behind, one of the many reasons behind having timesheets. It's not only to calculate your H election, but to calculate, if you have an affiliated organization, how much the C4 owes the C3 for sharing office space and staff. So let's say under that agreement, the C4 owes the C3 $100,000 for using office space, computers, and staff time. The C4 can either pay the C3 $100,000, or the C3 can say, hey, my H election is $300,000. I have $100,000 left. I will just say you don't have to pay it, and that subsidy counts against the H election. Did I say that better? Mm-hmm. So making a grant to the C4 can be you're granting money, or you're granting your employees' time and your rent and your other things. So you can grant employee time to the C4, whether it's your C4 or another C4. Like, hey, borrow my employees for this project. If the C4 is not paying you for that, that employee time you're lending to the C4 counts against your H election, because you're basically making a grant, an in-kind grant of employee time. So once you start talking about affiliated organizations, and those tend to be bigger ones, but that's where it gets really strategic to do this. And I'll end with one more strategy point, and then we could kind of talk about some of the details with this. Even if you don't have an affiliate C3 or C4, but you're working with a group of nonprofits, there's going to be coalitions. There's going to be private foundations involved. Let me give a good example, just ones like healthcare. There's lots of healthcare public charities. There's lots of healthcare private foundations. There's a lot of things going on in the world of healthcare. There's a lot of work you could do as coalitions. And part of it is strategizing in terms of who's spending money where. So as we touched upon, each independent legal entity might have an H election. So again, because CNDC has it, everything you guys are doing counts under CNDC's H election. So it's not, you don't individually have, 20% of your budget. All of you together have 20% of CNDC's budget. But when working with coalitions, sometimes an organization will have a lot more H election limit than others. So part of us talking about, hey, who has the most money we could spend on lobbying, who doesn't? And a lot of it is really working together to figure out who can really engage in that educational side of the issue, the advocacy side, the education side, and really working within a group to strategize which organization is best for which point, which organization has the most H election amount. And, looking to see, let's pulling H election amounts, trying to figure out what it is together as a group and who's spending what. It's a really good strategy. And I'll end with this point. Someone once told me in a private foundation, and I think this is a really good analogy, 501c3s and advocacy get you to the 10-yard line. Lobbying gets you over, into end zone. Sorry, I just lost my foot. I lost my football analogy. The Broncos aren't in the playoffs, so I forgot my football analogy. So that's the key thing, is that there's so much work you do, and all the so all the C3 advocacy non-lobbying activities get you to the 10-yard line, and it's that legislative lobbying activities that get you over into the end zone. And that's where it comes to being strategic. All the work C3s can do, private foundations can do, that's not lobbying, because you're not supporting or opposing specific legislation, but it's that education, that aspect of it gets you so far. You're basically building the base. You're educating people about issues. And that education is so important, because when finally there is specific legislation, you already have in their head all this factual information. And getting out factual information, especially today, seems to be super important. And not all facts, but facts. And so educating people using facts and doing that, and then using your H election amount or working with lobbying organizations to then take that specific legislation and support or oppose it, that's what will get you into the end zone. And with that, I will open it up to any questions. And I know there's some, CNDC has some issues about how you do timesheets. So yes?
Private foundations themselves cannot lobby, but they can grant money.
Yeah, it's a question about private foundation granting money. A private foundation can make what's called a general operating grant to a C3 that lobbies, which just says, here's your money.
So it has to be a general operating.
Right. If a private foundation gives you a restricted grant, there's tons of rules around this, which is like a whole different topic, but they can't say they can't earmark funds for lobbying. And so you'll see lots of private foundation grant agreements that say you cannot use these funds for lobbying. Now, it's important, and I've worked with foundations to do this. If you're ever getting a general operating grant and you see that money, you see that language saying you can't use these funds for lobbying in a general operating grant, ask them to remove it, because it's probably a template letter and they don't know it. They don't need it in there. And if you get that letter and it says you can't use the funds for lobbying, even if it's a general operating grant, you can't use the funds for lobbying. They restricted it. But if you're doing a specific program grant and you're saying we need funds for this particular program, and you give them a budget and you say we have a $100,000 budget and $10,000 for lobbying, they can give you a grant up to $90,000. So there's lots of rules and private foundations, lots of them know about, but lots of, especially the small family foundations don't, and they have some very template grant agreement letter. Every grant agreement letter will have, you can't spend these funds on partisan politics, because that's the rule across the board. You guys can't do that anyways. But I always check for that, like you can't lobby. And if it's an operating grant, I ask them to remove it, because then you could use it to lobby. Because again, all the private foundation can do is they can't earmark funds for lobbying. So if they just give you a nice grant, you could use it, but you have to check those words. And those are the words that people who take in the money, they'll read the grant agreement and decide whether it's restricted or not. And sometimes it's restricted for a project, but sometimes even if it's restricted for a project, you could still use it for the project as long as it's not covering the lobbying portion of the budget. So again, if you submit a budget and 10% of the budget is for the fee for a lobbyist, they can only pay 90% of the budget. Anything else? Yes?
So we had CDHS get a budget line item that is on the governor's budget that has to be approved by the legislature. And we're trying to figure out what our organization, as far as, I guess, lobbying and educating to make sure it gets not cut.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, so I know what your question is. The question is, if you see the governor's budget, which comes from the governor, is that legislation or lobbying, if you're going to lobby for the line item?
Well, the line item's already there.
Right.
So CHS, so Reggie got the line item on the budget. Now we, want to make sure that it does not get cut. So it has to be approved.
Yeah, so it has. So this is something where the governor submits a budget, and then the legislature gets to submit and pass their own budget. And what you're wanting to do is, hey, make sure that item's in your proposal. So this comes down to needing to understand what's exactly going on, because I don't know the answer to it exactly, but has the legislator, what's it called, what's the name of that bill? The long bill. Like, part of it's, where's the long bill? Is it specific legislation? Where is it in the session now? It might be specific legislation now, because if you're saying keep that in the long bill, it's probably lobbying, because the long bill's in existence. So again, this is kind of figuring out, and this is the same with the executive orders, what's the executive branch doing and what's the legislative branch doing. And, even if you're saying, referencing the executive order or what the executive branch has done, is there specific legislation on the legislative side that would make it lobbying? And I think with the long bill, at this point it is, because it's already in session.
Because we want it to be.
You want to stay on the long bill, right? Yeah.
But if they would reach out to me and say, we'd like you to come tell us more about this program as a director class, then that's allowed.
Yeah, and again, there's two different exclusions from lobbying. One is if a committee requests you to come. But another one is if you go, even if it's just one person who requests it, but you don't support or oppose legislation. Again, this is this education thing where you have to be really careful, because it's a hard gray line. It's hard not to support it, but we're very much like, this factually is what it does, and leave it at that. That's not lobbying either. But if you have that broader kind of invitation from the committee, you could not be as worried about your language because you're being invited by a committee to speak. Yes?
So we're thinking about how we're planning out for the amount of time we're spending in lobbying versus not. If we run an advocacy academy for volunteers, like 90% of it is like issue education and skills-based training. And the last 10% is in another organization. Like, so now that you know this, you should go help us on this bill. So So if we have like a staff person spending, say, 10 hours to set that up, does she charge off an hour? Like, do we count an hour of that as lobbying? 90% of the thing is not lobbying?
So there's timesheets, and actually doing this is like the hard part because the IRS has no rules, and what they ask you to do is be consistent and logical. So, which is tough. And, you know, timesheets is really the best way, because I actually went through an audit with an organization that had a C3 and a C4. And they're like, do you have timesheets? I'm like, here's our timesheets. And they were very happy and let it go. So I don't know how much they get into this. I certainly advise people that come up with something that's logical and that you could support if you're doing it. And part of it is, okay, here's the person spent 10% of their time preparing for this. Therefore, or rather, here's all the time they spent preparing for it. 10% was spent on lobbying. Therefore, classify 90% of her time as non-lobbying and 10% as lobbying. I always advise nonprofits that if they can, and if they do so much of this, have some sort of written guidelines, because that will protect the nonprofit. And again, on an IRS audit, the IRS wants to see that you've trained your people, they know how to do this. This is one of the reasons we're doing this, right? Is because then they see if they have timesheets and you guys have training, that they would just look at the timesheets to be like, we know what you guys are doing, versus how do you guys know how to classify something? That's why it's so important we're doing this. So again, pick something logical and make sure to the extent you have written documentation showing it. But yeah, if someone spends, and that happens a lot, you know, we're doing a whole session, the last 10% is lobbying, you know, just 10% of that expenses was lobbying expenses.
Before you even get to the coding or any of that, I think the bottom line is if you plan to lobby, just contact me. And again, we have Kara has said multiple times that lobbying is okay. Lobbying is allowed. And we're completely fine with our projects lobbying. We just want to be in the loop so that we can help you set it up correctly and work with you on coding and figuring out how much time to code to it and all of those things. That's why we're here. So if you plan to lobby, please reach out to me directly to get some of those systems set up and in place in order to do that. And then from a coding standpoint, some of you are already doing this, some of you have been lobbying, but there are two ways that you'll be tracking expenses related to lobbying. One is with your timesheets, and the other are direct expenses that you're either getting reimbursed for or that you're paying directly through our accounts payable system. And if it's a payroll issue, if you do have staff who are lobbying, then your staff accountant will work with you to set up a lobbying code in Paycom. And we actually have two program codes associated with lobbying, one for grassroots and one for direct. I'm gonna read my notes so I don't tell you the wrong thing. I'm also going to send this out over email so you all have it. For direct lobbying, so let me back up. Does everybody remember the difference, or should I go over the difference again between account codes and program codes? Okay. Account codes are those general ledger codes like for lobbying, for example, 6235, or program expense 6615, or mileage 6405. And I have a bunch more memorized, but I won't share all those with you. But those are what we mean by account codes. So those are the specific line items in your budgets when you're doing, when you're putting your budgets together. So those expenses that are in there, those are what those account codes refer to in terms of expense line items. So for lobbying, you're always going to use the expense code 6235. Even if you want it coded to somewhere else, we just ask you to code it to lobbying, so it's easier for us to do the 990 at the end of the year. And then by program code, what we mean by that, if you've looked at the expense form before, there's the column for account code. There's a column for grant code. Some of you have grants. Those are like P41 or G68, those are the grant codes that are associated. So those are what we mean by grant codes. So any of you who have restricted funds have a grant code, or often multiple grant codes that you're using on your expense forms. And then by program code, this is how we're going to start tracking the difference between direct and grassroots lobbying. So those codes, there's a column on the expense form that says program code, and those codes are LOB, all capital letters, for direct, and GRL, all capital letters, for grassroots. And so in theory, you could have 6235 for your account code being coded to grant G34 because it does allow for lobbying, and you're doing grassroots, and so it's GRL. So this is like alphabet soup, right? So in theory, you could be using all three of those codes, but if you're doing lobbying, you're at least using 6235, and then either grassroots or direct for those program codes. And when we get those expense forms, if you have written a grant code, that's where we're going to be going back to that, let's say the foundation award letter. And if it does restrict lobbying, we'll come back to you and say, unfortunately, this grant doesn't allow for lobbying. Here it is in the grant agreement. We will be changing this to your unrestricted funds unless you let us know you want it coded somewhere else. You've all probably received those types of emails before. So that's CNDC's job, is to really make sure that you all are tracking that appropriately and to help you get set up to track that appropriately. For those of you who have employees who are lobbying, so again, if you have volunteers, you're only tracking direct expenses, but for those of you who have employees, your staff accountant will be going in there to set up those direct and grassroots lobbying codes, so that when you go to select your project and whether it's coded to lobbying, you'll be selecting your project name and then either grassroots or direct. This will make more sense when you do it, but there's essentially a drop-down menu where you'll just be selecting those codes. So again, I'm going to send this out over email. We'll be going over it with those of you who are already doing lobbying, so it's very clear to everybody. But are there any general questions? I know those are very specific details. Yes, Austin.
How do we know where we're at with 20%? How much?
So you will know that because on your financial statements every month, it will show you at least the direct expenses that are coded to lobbying, and we'll be able to do a specific, anytime somebody is using a project or a program code, you will get a separate report that shows you which expenses are tracked to those program codes. So we'll also be able to track it that way as well.
And so for our planning purposes, we should think of 20% of us, not 20% of students.
Correct. So it is true. Yes, good question. It is true that overall it is 20% of CNDC's budget, right? And so obviously some of you aren't lobbying, you're not using any of that. Some of you could in theory go a little bit over that 20%, and that's why it's nice that you're under CNDC, because it's 20% of our overall budget. But we are asking projects to keep your lobbying at 20% of your budget. And that's important because if you decide that it's in your organization's best interest to spin off, you'll already have been doing that. You'll already have been spending that 20%. Good question.
Some of the federal grants have prohibitions against lobbying and
Definitely.
through the state. So that would mean we need another source of unrestricted funds if we're going to do lobbying, even though we would have 20% of the grant. We really don't have access to that money to do lobbying because of the specific prohibition. That's
correct. So if your project is funded by one federal grant and that's it, you would not be able to do lobbying because it would be prohibited by that contract. Yes.
We do a lot of sign on to other people's things stuff. And our national organization will occasionally send out action alerts, our lists, because we share a contact database. I have the option of asking them to opt us out of those. Would that be preferable?
If there's no expense, then it's not even lobbying.
This is an interesting question about whether if your group is supporting a particular law that the Violence Against Women Act. As I mentioned before, if you're supporting any legislation, you're not also supporting a particular candidate for public office. So there's no election happening right now, so timing is really important. So any work you're doing regarding that would be lobbying, but it wouldn't necessarily tie in to the Democrats. And part of this, again, is timing. The election's over. So in terms of that risk of being supporting or opposing candidates or political parties, that risk is over until it all starts up again. And even then, I'd like to say that despite, I still feel deep in my heart that there are some kind of issues that aren't necessarily tied to any political party. Again, the IRS has said if pro-choice and pro-life, yes, those are tied. But there's other issues. So this is that gray area. The IRS has come out with certain things where if you're talking about legislation and it's really close to a election, you have to be, like, the further away it is from the election, the more freedom you have to talk about that issue. And because the election's over now, I think we're fine for a while. But at a certain point, when you're getting close to the election and you're just bringing up a particular thing, it could be perceived to be indirect support or opposition to a candidate or political party.
And I'll just add, and maybe Kara can repeat this for me for those on live streaming. If you have questions about what is or isn't lobbying, please just ask me. I am happy to help walk you through that. And if I don't know, we'll go to Kara or we'll go to, you know, someone and get the answer for that. But if in doubt and you're not sure, please just reach out to me.
And again, you know, we're saying, please come to, you know, CNDC, please ask. These things, they're not easy. This is not, I mean, you had this for an hour and a half. You will not remember this. I talk about this all the time. I have clients who I work with this every year on, and every year they forget. And it's hard and it's technical, and lots of it is understanding some things that we don't understand. And that's why, you know, we're all here. And my email is on the invitation. Email me. It's something where oftentimes I can answer like this, and it's just something where, you know, that's why we're here to help support you with these things. But don't ever kind of think you don't have support for figuring out what these questions are.
We had one more chat question. Our community organization, a 501c3 beneath CDC, has provided money to a school district to create a master plan to apply for a BEST grant with the eventual goal of building a new school. At some point, this may move into a campaign for a tax bond. Mm-hmm. At what point does the 501c3 need to pull back from the campaign, and how would they do so?
Okay, when does, if 501c3 is working with the school board to eventually try to use some sort of mill levy bond or something like that to get additional funding. You know, first of all, you're working with the school board. So at that point, it's not even legislative, right? So all the work leading up to that is not legislative at all. And at a certain point, this is going to go to the people of Colorado. So until that measure gets titled, is what the technical term is. It goes before the title board and gets titled, and the petition starts. There's no specific legislation. So that's a lot of time to do work on issues, and that's why it's so important to understand that. There's tons of work you could do, and until that measure gets titled, there's no lobbying or legislation. Even once it becomes titled and the petition starts circulating, you could still work on it. You just need to work on it within your lobbying election.
But I want to thank Kara so much for her help today. Thank you. Yes. She did an awesome job, and she's, you know, I've heard her multiple times, and I learned something new every time I hear this presentation. So please thank her on your way out for her time today. If you have specific questions, she has offered to stay extra to answer questions. And then again, I just want to reiterate, CNDC is here to help. So please come to me if you are lobbying, so that I can help you get set up with that. And then if you have questions about what is lobbying, I'm also happy to help with that. So thank you all for your time. We appreciate you being here.